The first Opium War took place in Canton. There was an expedition that went up here to this area here, because this is Peking, although it's not shown on the map. But there is a river called the Pilo River with the Grand Canal that leads to Peking. And in the first Opium War, there was an attempt to actually sail up the river, but the Chinese settled before any damage was done. In the Second Chinese War, once again, Canton was involved, and that's where a lot of fighting took place. But most of the fighting took place here at the forts at the base of this river, or the mouth of this river. And in the process, the rather large French, United States and British fleet sailed right up the coast and sacked all of the treaty ports. And they're the ones that you see here. They're all called different names now, but you know, you can see there was a fair few of them before they got to the Tatra forts, and that's when the real action took place. The Opium Wars, as they are now known, 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, were fought against the Chinese Empire, firstly by Britain, and then later with Britain, France and the United States, to force China to open up to foreign trade. In particular, to have China import opium. China lost these wars thoroughly, but not so much through incompetence or the bravery of its military, but through military technological backwardness. I think I would have to say that there was some incompetence in some of the general staff of the Chinese, but they did all the right things militarily, but they just didn't have the military equipment to follow it up. The three commodities were the causes of these wars: silver, tea, and of course opium. It was also a clash of cultures, the grasping, thrusting capitalists of Europe and later the United States seeking trading profits, and the largely pacifist culture of China, which had never rated military skills highly. Silver had been a staple of Chinese currency for over 1,000 years. The white metal was highly admired, and its scarcity, China had few deposits, gave it value. It was used in trade along the Silk Road and in the limited maritime trade to the countries of the south, that is the Philippines, Indonesia, Melanesian islands and so forth. Within China, demand suddenly increased when in 1580, the Ming Emperor Zheng Zhuhen, following taxation reforms, decreed all taxes would be paid in silver ingots, and that all foreign traders would now have to pay for Chinese exports in silver, coin or bullion. Prior to these reforms, taxes and central government expenditure, say salaries of the government administrators, that's mandarins like Sir Humphrey, were paid in kind, in grain, livestock, other metals, copper coins like the cash. The small Chinese coin with a square hole in it is called a cash. And it's got a hole in the middle so you can hang it around your neck on a piece of string. Or paper money. Now, paper money had never been considered reliable, although it had been in use for something like 600 years, and was therefore not popular. And copper coins were of very low value and were not practical for large transactions. So the old system was cumbersome and inefficient. It also facilitated corruption, and Chinese farmers and traders and other taxpayers had over the centuries become expert at tax avoidance. You can imagine that if you're paying your tax in wheat, then you'll never declare how much wheat that you harvested, or rice, or your livestock. Somehow all of your livestock would disappear when the tax inspector called, and you'd say, well, I only have one pig, and you can't take that from me. China had little silver deposits. Silver had to come from outside China. As it so happened, Spain had invaded South America, Peru and Mexico in the late 15th century. Well, not late so much, as early as 1540, they were making incursions into the hinterland of Peru, and discovered huge deposits of silver, which they began to mine in the most ruthless way possible. When the indigenous people, who they recruited, were decimated, slaves from Africa took their place, and millions died. It's estimated that by the 1600, after 100 and something or other years, they had already killed off 3 or 4 million indigenous population and African slaves. The average lifespan, apparently, of a worker in the silver mines, apart from the fact that it was very dangerous, but there are all sorts of other problems, like, for instance, dust and accident. Yeah, millions died. The amount of silver extracted was staggering. Spain, who only received 1/5 of the silver mined, it belonged to the Spanish king, had by 1600 pocketed 35,000 tonnes of silver. As an aside, Spanish monarchs used those funds to turn Europe into a battlefield over religion, and so therefore they wasted it all. The rest circulated in Europe, the Spanish Philippines, adjacent countries, and fuelled international trade. China began to vigorously export to get silver, mainly to Europe. Ceramics and porcelain, tea, silk, rice, silverware. Their silverware is still very highly prized, silverware from that period. Furniture, wallpaper, tapestry and ornaments. And they were paid in silver bullion. The Chinese then quickly became by far the richest men in the world, sitting on a mountain of silver. However, by the 1820s, silver began to flow out of China. China did not grow opium, although it was known as a pain reliever for over 1,000 years. Being highly addictive, its production and use in China, except for medicinal purposes, had always been discouraged, usually by decree. But from the 1770s, British merchants, frustrated that China was not interested in any European trade goods in lieu of silver, decided to turn a small, nascent market for opium into a marketable trading item to supplement the silver they had to buy from Spain. Opium was grown in Bengal and loaded onto the Honourable East India Company ships, which sailed to China. With the help of corrupt Chinese officials and merchants, they began to offload opium along the southern coast, avoiding the only port open to foreign trade, Canton, situated on the Pearl River. So most of those ports south of Canton in particular. Later, as the trade corrupted officialdom, opium was openly traded in Canton and Macau. Traders distributed opium throughout the hinterland, Chinese traders. No European was allowed to travel widely in China. As with any highly addictive product, the trade began to grow, and by 1820 silver used to pay for opium began to flow out of China, and the Chinese silver reserves began to decrease. Tea. Tea began to be drunk in England in the late 1600s, and its mild stimulatory effect and taste became popular. Initially expensive, ever more imports reduced the price, and the drink became available to all classes. The trade was initially controlled by the Dutch East India Company, VOC. The Honourable East India Company, there was nothing honourable about the Honourable East India Company, violently wrested the trade from the Dutch in a private war of the 1780s. And in the late 1780s, and although not holding the monopoly, handled most of the tea exports from China until 1833, when the Honourable East India trading monopoly with China was cancelled by the British government. But it continued to make fortunes for its officers and investors as England became the tea-drinking country of Europe. A word on the clash of cultures. The Opium Wars had their roots on the incomprehensibility of East and West. The Chinese regarded China as the centre of the world and all other nations as vassal or tributary states. And in a way they still do. Even the most elevated foreign dignitaries were regarded as supplicants and were expected to kowtow, that's bowing 9 times with your forehead on the ground. This was intolerable to the English, who had their own view at the time and for some time after, that they also had a claim to ruling the world. And regularising trade between the countries was of vital importance to industrialised Britain and their empire. It was an obligation, a mission. They controlled the seas and were determined to trade with China. The two cultures were on a collision course. In this, the Chinese, this vast and diverse people, were at a huge disadvantage. In spite of 3,000 years of internal dissent and rebellion and continuous struggle to protect its frontiers, China appears to have been a peace-loving nation. They had good reason to prefer peace. China was a useful and habitable area of Asia where life could be very productive. Cultural conversion and alliances could be preferable to a force of arms. Even the 13th century Mongol invasion, once established in China, seems to have been subdued by this Chinese aversion to all things military. When Genghis Khan first invaded China, he and his generals had decided to kill all of the Chinese, just ride them down or starve them or kill them. But the mandarins in the court of the emperor persuaded them that they'd probably get more out of China if they kept everybody alive and simply taxed them for what they needed. And that was the attitude of the Mongols, absolutely ruthless. And even they managed to be subdued by this Chinese approach. The Chinese were not only unwilling but incapable of making modern war. Even though they'd invented gunpowder in the 11th century and had later bribed Jesuit priests to show them how to cast cannon, they remained light years behind the ferment of 19th century military and naval innovation. Their junks, for instance, were small, thin-hulled and carried few cannon, no match for a British man of war or a steam-driven gunboat. Although the mandarins over the centuries probably read Sun Tzu, he wrote his treatise in 500 BC, even now regarded as a seminal treatise on military strategy, they probably ignored his good advice. We now come to the First Opium War and the story of Commissioner Lin, which is a salutary lesson in what usually happens to a conscientious, talented public servant who is given the task of introducing unpopular policy. We still see it all the time, public servant hung out to dry because policies change. In 1833, the Honourable East India Company had its monopoly in the trade with China revoked by the British government, and the volume of opium exploded with merchants from the US, Portugal and Britain entering the trade. Opium, then under British control, became 50% by value of India, which was at that stage British, exports. Millions of Chinese were now addicted to smoking opium, and the number was increasing exponentially, particularly in the middle and upper classes. In 1835, 27,000 chests of opium worth some 17 million silver dollars. It's very hard to put a value on that sort of figure these days, but you'd be looking at $2 or $3 billion per annum, were imported into Canton. The average Chinese labourer was spending 2/3 of a daily wage on an opium habit. And interestingly enough, this is the proportion of income most modern drug addicts presently spend on their illegal drug habit. In 1838, Emperor Daoguang sent his most incorruptible official, Lin Zihu, stamp out the trade. Lin was given plenary powers. Initially, he wrote to Queen Victoria on moral grounds, admonishing her for allowing such a cruel and destructive trade and asking that no more opium be shipped to China. For many years it was believed the letter never reached her, but it is now accepted that it did, and she was advised not to act on it by her parliament, who were very strongly commercially oriented and making a lot of money out of the opium trade. She was a very new queen. She can't be blamed, I don't think. Lin acted decisively. He put thousands of addicts into special hospitals and arrested 1,600 Chinese merchants and some hundreds of foreign merchants. Then in March he demanded the surrender of 21,000 chests of opium held by foreign merchants. Fearing for their lives, the merchants complied and the opium was destroyed. It was crushed up and poured into the ocean. And Lin said a little prayer for the fish. But then if the fish did suffer, what a way to go. Lin then ordered all the foreigners to leave and not return unless they signed bonds promising never to trade again in opium. These traders refused to comply and retreated to the barren island of Hong Kong. Landing to resupply, they were expelled by Chinese troops, some of whom were then killed by fire from a British warship. Then at the mouth of the Pearl River, 29 war junks which had blockaded Canton attacked 2 British frigates who returned fire and sank 4 junks. The rest of the junks, some badly damaged, escaped up the river but continued their blockade. The British government responded with breathtaking immorality by sending an expeditionary force of some 4,000 men and 48 ships to China. They too blockaded Canton and also the Yangtze, the Ningpo and the mouth of the Pilo River, which leads to Peking, which was guarded by forts. There were a number of minor skirmishes. Inconclusive negotiations dragged on with the Chinese provincial viceroy in Canton. Eventually the British decided to attack with naval support the forts at the mouth of the Pearl River leading to Canton. The forts fell in a matter of days. The Chinese lost hundreds killed and many more wounded, but the British had no casualties. The British smoothbore flintlock and percussion muskets with bayonets proved far superior to the Chinese matchlock and medieval edged weapons and the bow and arrow. Chinese cannon were antiquated, of an inferior casting. They often blew up. Chinese soldiers generally fought well but were untrained and badly led. In February, negotiations having stalled, warships moved up the Pearl River and troops landed. In the next 2 days, they captured all of the forts around Canton and sank some 40 war junks. The local commander, General Yang Fang, what a name, Yang Fang, agreed to negotiate but then stalled. That sort of standard Chinese diplomatic practice. It was only when the British military commander posted troops in Canton and threatened the city's destruction that General Yang Fang gave in. Trade recommenced, other ports still resisted. In August 1841, a naval force of 2 battleships, 7 smaller warships, 4 armed steamers and 23 transports with 2,700 men, taking Aimai, Chusan, Chanai and Ningpo, and after wintering in Ningpo, the force took a series of forts at Hangzhou, defended by 8,000 Chinese. The forts, bombarded from the fleet and attacked from the land, fell in 4 hours. The British, they're moving steadily up the coast. The British then moved on to Shanghai and up the river to Nanking. Encountering 40-foot city walls, they noticed that soldiers were crowding the battlements, Chinese soldiers. And so they engaged in very heavy fighting until the city gates were blown open by cannon fire and the city fell. Chinese casualties were heavy, they were in their thousands. Many Chinese soldiers killed themselves rather than surrender. The fleet sailed on to Nanking, a city with even more formidable defences. However, the Emperor's emissaries came out to negotiate. Chinese resistance ceased. Every military contact with the British had resulted in a humiliating defeat for the completely outclassed Chinese army and navy. By the terms of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, Britain acquired the island of Hong Kong, diplomatic representation in Peking, the right to trade in the ports of Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningpo and Shanghai. Further treaties gave other countries, including France and the USA, the same privileges as Britain, including the right to live in special areas, concessions, where their own laws operated. The opium trade was not legalised, but was indirectly approved a year or so later when an official tariff was applied to a number of goods, including opium. China was to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. You're talking about billions now, covering the value of the opium destroyed by Commissioner Lin and the cost of the expeditionary force. British warships and soldiers would only be withdrawn when the amount was paid, and the amount was paid within 6 months. Commissioner Lin, the poor bastard, the public servant who'd done his job, was demoted and sent out to see his days as an administrator in a remote province. And the opium trade boomed. By 1860, it was estimated that 70% of Chinese males were addicted to opium. China had paid a high price for being unable to defend its sovereignty. The Second Opium War started over a minor incident, like most wars. In 1856, a schooner rigged like a junk anchored in Canton Harbour and was boarded by Chinese officials who arrested the crew for piracy. The ship was captained by an Englishman, but owned by a Chinese businessman resident in Hong Kong. At some time, it had been registered as an English ship, but the registration had expired. The British consul, without legal justification, demanded the return of the crew and an apology from the highest-ranked Chinese official in Canton, the Viceroy. Some of the crew were returned, but no apology was forthcoming. The Viceroy kept the ship, as it was Chinese-built, and kept the crew members who were known pirates. It sounds perfectly reasonable, however, the British then seized a private Chinese vessel as compensation and towed it away. The Treaty of Nanking had not gone smoothly. Both sides over the years had complained about treaty breaches. Behind British complaints was a desire to improve their position in China, gain access to the whole of the country, more freedom of movement and better trading terms. Disrespect and disregard of Chinese law, custom and practice, plus dishonest dealing by foreigners, rankled Chinese traders and the Chinese administration. So there was a war just waiting to happen. A squadron of the Royal Navy was sent to blockade the Pearl River. Once again, this is occurring around Canton, and bombarded the city, in particular razing the Viceroy's palace in the process. The Viceroy put a bounty on British heads and several murders took place. And that was really a declaration of war. The Royal Navy called for reinforcements. Reinforcements were sent to Canton and the Navy was sent to the Grand Canal and cut off the supply of food to Peking, even then regarded as the capital. There was some opposition in the British Parliament to this gunboat diplomacy over a trumped-up incident, but it was felt that commercial interests were paramount. Consequently, reinforcements were sent to Hong Kong. These included a French contingent and ships. France had joined in seeking to take advantage and improve on its trading position with China. In late 1857, a joint force sailed up the Pearl River and thoroughly sacked the city and set it on fire. The treasury was plundered and millions of pounds worth of silver and gold was sent off to India, to the British Viceroy in India. The Viceroy of the province containing Canton was arrested and imprisoned at Calcutta, where he died a year later. He was locked up in a dungeon and starved. Fleet then moved to the mouth of the Pilo River. So we're now talking about the river that leads to Peking. Not receiving any meaningful exchange from the emperor, they attacked the river forts and moved the fleet up to Tenzing, which is about halfway between the river mouth and Peking. The sacking of Canton resulted in the Treaty of Tenzing. It provided for the right of foreign diplomatic missions to reside at Peking and for foreigners who committed offences to be tried in courts of their own country. Foreigners now had the right to travel through the empire. It protected missionaries and opened the interior to foreign trade and established 11 new treaty ports, making 16 in all. China was to pay £1.3 million to Britain and £700,000 to France for the cost of the expedition. The treaty was sent to London and Paris for ratification. There was only one problem. When the envoys in March 1859, a year later, returned to China to seek the treaty's affirmation, they found the Pilot River blocked and an army of 50,000 Chinese soldiers assembled to stop the envoys from reaching Peking. The emperor had clearly had a change of heart. The envoys had arrived with a British battleship, 2 frigates and 13 gunboats, as well as a French frigate and gunboat. An attempt to breach the river obstacles and the forts at the mouth of the river failed miserably. The forts were surrounded by mudflats. The forts had thousands and thousands of soldiers in them. The Chinese had taken advantage of the break to reinforce the forts with more cannon, and they just massacred this attempt by the British and the French to take the forts. Oh, and there were obstacles in the river itself, pylons, steel mesh, stone piles and all sorts of things to stop ships moving up the river. An attempt to breach the river obstacles and the forts at the mouth of the river failed miserably with considerable losses. The formation retreated to Hong Kong. A large military force was assembled. 70 British warships, 20 transports plus 40 transports and warships were collected. It made its way up the coast and in July 1860 landed 22,000 troops in the exact same place, the Gulf of Pachili, where the Pilo River leading to Peking meets the sea. There were 4 forts at the mouth of the river that protected the river mouth, and they were some 16 kilometres away from where the soldiers were landed. The northernmost fort was chosen as being the most important, and after careful preparation, the fort was pounded to rubble. That was partly done by some of the gunboats, but it was mostly by attack by soldiers who dragged their field guns with them. After 4 or 5 days, the fort was pounded to rubble. The other forts capitulated. This was the last major engagement of the Second Opium War. The river route to Peking was now open. The Chinese put up fierce resistance, but the remaining 22 forts along the river fell one by one, as did the towns. Several large Chinese army, up to 20,000 soldiers, were dispersed. They were no match for mobile field artillery, percussion muskets. At that stage, they were using percussion rifles as well. And the Chinese were still armed with very unreliable and inefficient matchlocks, bows and arrows, and rather poor quality hand arms. Peking, under the threat of bombardment, surrendered. The emperor was nowhere to be seen. He had escaped to Mongolia, where he died the following year. And just as an aside, his concubine, Zhu He, later Empress of China, took his place, abolished the Regency Council, and went on to rule China for 40 years. She gets a lot of bad press, does Empress Xi, but she was a very efficient Empress of China. And when she died, China just fell apart. The Emperor's brother, Prince Ku, received Lord Elgin, the British envoy. No, he wasn't the Lord Elgin of the Elgin Marbles, he was the son, and ratified the Treaty of Tenzing. Tenzing was a city south of Peking. The treaty ceded the Kowloon Peninsula to Britain, added Tenzing to the list of treaty ports, and agreed to pay the costs of the expedition to Peking, and so ended the Second Opium War. Just to make a point, as a lesson to future emperors to maintain peace and security, Lord Elgin ordered the burning of the Emperor's summer palace, a huge complex outside the city of Peking, containing galleries, museums, libraries, pavilions, all filled with priceless treasures collected over 1,000 years and set in 8 square miles of landscaped gardens, lawns and woodlands. That, with the indiscriminate looting of the ancient forbidden city, was a wanton act of cultural destruction, and even by the standards of the day was reprehensible. British and French forces left China, not to return until the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, a rebellion largely the result of the humiliation China had suffered during and in the wake of the Opium Wars. Now, look, I'll just show you a couple of pictures. That's a cartoon that appeared about 1830, 33 in the Times. And it's all of the British officials carrying gifts, trying to impress the Emperor of China, who naturally, of course, is the one lying on the cushion, and trying to get him to sign a treaty. But the Chinese were adamant. There was nothing that the British had that they wanted. They were quite self-sufficient. If they wanted to trade with China, then they had to use silver. They were only interested in silver. That's supposed to be an action at the mouth of the Pearl River, the first Opium War, and it's a pretty good example of what was happening to the junks. As you can see, they're not actually set up to be warships, and they burned beautifully after cannon shot, particularly explosive shells. But the ship in the background is a British steam frigate, the Nemesis. And of course, a steam-powered ship in the days of sail, where your opposition were all sail, had a huge advantage. And the Nemesis was quite well armed with some early rifled muzzle-loading cannon and firing explosive shells. This wasn't a bombardment of the sort. It's supposed to be a picture of some of the fleet gathered at Hong Kong prior to their last excursion up the coast to Peking. And as you can see, there's the steam frigate in the foreground. Jardine Matheson took over after the Honourable East India Company lost its monopoly to trade in China, and they were drug runners. That was their main activity for the rest of the 19th century. This is intended to be an action off the Pilo River, appeared in the Times, and the explosions that you see, highly exaggerated. One is a fort blowing up and the other one's a ship. This was the attacking in the first Opium War. This is Canton being bombarded by the fleet and burning. And I assume that that building is the Viceroy's palace. Another shot of the Nemesis. You can see the Nemesis on the left and all of the junks on the right. And the amount of troops that were carried by the transports making their way towards the shore. That is probably the landing of the troops in their last engagement at the mouth of the river leading to Peking. Taku forts, this is, you might remember that they attacked one fort, the northernmost fort at the mouth of the river, Pilo, leading to Peking. And this photograph, and I was surprised I couldn't find more photographs of the Opium Wars, was a shot taken after the fort fell. It was taken the next morning. And as you can see, the forts were actually constructed of clay bricks and timber, and it was no match for explosive shells. The cannons of the British and the French just blew the forts to pieces. Indeed, to the point where the forts no longer exist. Hong Kong was ceded in the Treaty of Nanking, in the first Opium War, and then in the Treaty of Tenzing, which was later, Kowloon was leased to the British, but Hong Kong had been given to the British in perpetuity, and in 1997. There was some thought as to whether they would continue to hang on to it, but the British government decided it was all too much trouble, and so they ceded the whole thing back to China. They'd got Hong Kong in perpetuity. They didn't need to give it back to China. But Kowloon and the territories around Kowloon, they were under a lease, and the lease expired in 97. So the British just handed the lot back. I mean, they've had enough trouble with holding on to Gibraltar. So they didn't want to hold a little piece of land. It would have divided the city of Hong Kong, because a lot of Hong Kong is actually on the mainland as well. I think that the culture of preferring peace to war is very strong in China. They certainly haven't ever done... there's only one war, or it's actually not a war, where they invaded Vietnam after the war ended, just to show who was boss. And they flattened the Vietnamese army, and then they withdrew. And I think it was, you know, you are a vassal state of, you might call yourself Vietnam, but actually you're a vassal state of China. They didn't fight particularly well in the Korean War. They lost something like 5 million soldiers and that's why they've been so wary about entering into any sort of long-term war with the Allies or the Western powers since. Their skirmishes with India, they've always come off second best. So if they do go to war, although they've got this massive army, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be good militarily. But we have to wait and see. All right, well, that's it. Thank you very much indeed.